So here I am going to discuss a technique that will restructure your negative thoughts. A theory called cognitive mediation says that how we feel emotionally is not the result of what happens to us, but instead it's the result of how we think about what happens to us. This means that we can change the way we feel by changing the way we think about what happens to us. Here's an example from a recent therapy client of mine. I was browsing Facebook one evening before bed and noticed that my best friend had posted how much fun she had had with another one of our friends earlier that day. I immediately felt sad and a little angry because I had just spent the previous day with her and had a great time, but she didn't post anything about our day. Before I knew it, I was thinking about all the reasons my best friend might not be really as good as a friend as I thought, and secretly wants to ditch me as a friend. I had been perfectly happy all evening, and within 3 minutes, I was an anxious, despondent mess. A quick note before we jump in. Like running on the treadmill or practicing scales on the piano, the power of this technique comes from doing it consistently over time. Simply understanding it and doing it occasionally is not enough. For it to have a meaningful effect on your life, it must be done consistently and become a habit. What follows are 6 basic steps to follow in order to do cognitive restructuring. Step 1 is to hit the pause button. Cognitive restructuring can be useful in many situations, but the best time to use it is when you notice that you're feeling a strong negative emotional reaction to something, especially if your response seems out of proportion. Our typical way of responding to a sudden wave of negative feeling is to act on instinct. So when we're feeling angry, we lash out. When we feel anxious, we hide. When we feel sad, we have a beer. An alternate is to use the sudden strong emotion as a cue or reminder to hit the pause button instead. Then once we've briefly paused, ask yourself, what's going on here? When we can inhibit our instinctive response to negative feelings and approach it with an attitude of curiosity, our chances of managing the situation intelligently go way up. Once you've used a sudden strong emotion as a cue to pause, the next step is to identify what event triggered your response in the first place. So step 2 is to identify the trigger. A triggering event is often something that happens in our external environment. So for example, a co-worker makes a sarcastic comment, or a spouse gives us the look, a car cuts off in the freeway, etc. But events in our internal environment, that is in our minds, can also act as trigger. A thought pops into mind that we forgot to mention a critical idea during the meeting, or a memory of a recently deceased friend comes to mind, etc. To help identify the triggering event in a given situation, use who, what, when, and where. Who is or was present with me at the time I got upset? Because we're social animals by nature, people often play either a direct or indirect role in our emotional reactions. What happened? Literally, what sorts of things happened to me leading me to feeling this way? Remember that no detail or fact is too small to be influential. The trigger does not have to be something big and obvious. In fact, often it's something quite small and subtle. When did I first start feeling this upset? What happened immediately before this? This question is particularly important if you're doing a cognitive restructuring hours or days after the fact. Where did it all occur? Often the initial triggers for becoming upset are part of or connected with our physical environment. Step 3 is to notice your automatic thoughts. Automatic thoughts are our default initial interpretations of what happens to us. They're almost always spontaneous. We don't initiate them. And they typically take the form of verbal self-talk or sometimes images and memories. Or if you see an email from your boss late at night, your automatic thought might be, oh no, what's wrong? I must have forgotten something earlier. We all have automatic thoughts all the time, and most of the time we either don't notice them at all or we are only vaguely aware of them. When it comes to cognitive restructuring, it's important to build the habit of becoming more aware of our automatic thoughts and really examining them closely. Step 4 is to identify your emotional reaction and note how intense it is. Emotions are generated from our mental interpretations of things that happen, and the type and intensity of the emotions we experience depend almost entirely on the type of thinking we engage in. For example, using the example from above of being cut off while driving, if your thought is what a jerk, you're likely to feel angry. If your thought is what the hell is he thinking, you're likely to feel an even stronger form of anger, perhaps bordering on rage. On the other hand, if your automatic thought was, oh my god, he almost hit me, I'm going 70 miles an hour, I would have died, you are much more likely to experience something like fear or anxiety. Finally, your emotional response can contain more than just one emotion. If your automatic thought had been, what a jerk, he almost hit me, you'd probably experience some mixture of anger and anxiety. In this case, it's good to note both, but typically there will be one that's stronger or more dominant. Finally, for each emotion identified, rate how intense it was on a scale from 1 to 10. Step 5 is to generate alternative thoughts. Once you've identified a trigger, notice your automatic thoughts about that trigger and take a note of your emotional reaction. The next step is to come up with an alternative thought for each of your initial automatic thoughts. For example, sticking with the car's example from above, instead of, oh my god, he almost hit me, I'm going 70 miles an hour, I would have died, you might construct an alternative thought like, wow, that was scary, he got pretty close to hitting me, but I'm a pretty good driver and handled it well. Or instead of, what a jerk, he almost hit me, you might say something like, maybe his wife is going into labor in the back seat and he's on his way to the hospital. In any case, the important thing is to simply be flexible and come up with more interpretations than your first automatic one. This practice creates mental flexibility, a key component in the ability to disengage from negative thinking patterns and overwhelming emotions. Also, in addition to simply generating more alternative interpretations or explanations of what happened, it can be useful to notice any obvious errors in your initial thoughts and develop alternate thoughts that are more realistic. For example, if your automatic thought was, oh my god, he almost hit me, I would have died, you might point out to yourself that I would have died is far from certain even if he had hit you, and substitute a thought that contains something about how you're a good driver, and it's very possible that you could have acted soon enough to prevent an accident. If possible, generate at least 2 or 3 alternative thoughts for each overly negative automatic thought. Step 6 is to re-rate the intensity of your emotional response. After generating multiple alternate thoughts, return to your emotion that you identified in step 4 and reassess their intensity. Almost always, they will have gone down at least modestly as a function of questioning your automatic thoughts and generating alternative and more realistic ones. This final step is crucial because noticing and feeling the relief from your negative emotion decreasing is an important reinforcer of the new habit of cognitive restructuring. In other words, you are much more likely to stick with it as a habit and benefit in the long term if you get the reward of even slightly lower negative feelings as a result. It's essential to understand that the power and benefit of thought restructuring comes from the consistent practice of doing it.